The story of Hannibal begins not with a battle, but with a promise. In the 3rd century BC, the Mediterranean was a stage for the epic rivalry between two great powers, the mercantile sea empire of Carthage, based in modern-day Tunisia, and the burgeoning, disciplined Republic of Rome. The First Punic War had ended in 241 BC with a crushing defeat for Carthage. The city was stripped of its prized territory of Sicily, forced to pay crippling war reparations, and left seething with a deep and bitter resentment. At the heart of this bitterness was the brilliant Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca. He had fought the Romans to a standstill on land in Sicily and felt betrayed by the politicians back home who had sued for peace. He believed that the war was not over, merely paused. In this cauldron of humiliation and desire for revenge, he raised his son, Hannibal. The legend, told by Roman historians themselves, is powerful. Before leaving for his new command in Iberia, Spain, Hamilcar took his 9-year-old son, Hannibal, to the temple of Baal Hammon. There, before the sacrificial altar, he made the young boy place his hand on the offering and swear a solemn, sacred oath that as long as he lived, he would never be a friend of Rome. This oath would become the defining principle of Hannibal's life, the northern star by which he would navigate his destiny. It was a promise that would one day lead an army to the very gates of his enemy. Hamilcar did not intend to sit idly by. In Iberia, far from the meddling politics of Carthage, he and his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, began to carve out a new empire for the Barca family. They conquered vast swaths of the peninsula, securing immense wealth from its rich silver mines and, most importantly, recruiting fierce Celtic and Iberian warriors. They were not merely building a province. They were forging a weapon. This was Hamilcar's personal army, loyal to him and his family. Hardened by years of constant warfare, Hannibal grew up not in a palace, but in a military camp. He learned to ride before he could properly read, to fight alongside the men he would one day command. He ate the same rations, slept on the same hard ground, and endured the same hardships as the lowest-ranking mercenary. When his father was killed in battle and his brother-in-law was later assassinated, the army, without hesitation, unanimously acclaimed the 26-year-old Hannibal as their new commander in 219 BC. They saw in him his father's strategic genius, combined with a charismatic, almost reckless, bravery that they adored. Hannibal was now in command of one of the finest fighting forces in the ancient world, and the oath he swore as a child burned within him. He needed a pretext to unleash his weapon upon Rome, and he found it in the city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a Roman-allied city on the Iberian coast, but it lay south of the Ebro River, which had been informally established as the boundary between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. Claiming the city had attacked a local tribe under his protection, Hannibal laid siege to it. It was a calculated and deliberate provocation. He knew Rome would be honor-bound to defend its ally. The siege was long and brutal, lasting 8 months, but Saguntum eventually fell. As Hannibal had predicted, Rome was outraged. They sent an embassy to Carthage, demanding that the city-state hand over Hannibal for punishment. When the Carthaginian Senate hesitated, the Roman envoy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, famously held up 2 folds of his toga and declared, "I carry here peace and war. Choose which you will." The Carthaginians defiantly shouted back, "Give us whichever you please." Fabius let the fold representing war drop, and so began the Second Punic War. But Hannibal had no intention of fighting a defensive war or repeating the naval mistakes of his father. The Romans expected to fight him in Spain and then invade Africa. But Hannibal had conceived an audacious, almost insane gamble. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would take the fight to them. He would gather his army, some 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 36 war elephants, and march them out of Spain, across the Pyrenees, through hostile Gaul, And over the frozen, formidable barrier of the Alps, he would descend into Italy from the north, where the Romans would least expect him, and bring the war to their very doorstep. It was a plan of such breathtaking scope and peril that no one, least of all the Romans, believed it was even possible. The Roman Senate, confident in their naval supremacy, planned a conventional war. They would send one army to confront Hannibal in Spain and another to invade Carthage's home territory in Africa. They never conceived that Hannibal would do the impossible. In the spring of 218 BC, he set out from his Spanish capital, New Carthage, on one of the most audacious and legendary military campaigns in all of history. His first great obstacle was the Pyrenees mountains, and beyond them, the hostile tribes of southern Gaul. Through a combination of fierce fighting, swift diplomacy, and heavy bribes, he pushed his way to the Rhine River. Here, a Roman army had landed near Massilia, modern Marseille, but Hannibal, through clever scouting and rapid movement, managed to cross the river and evade them, leaving the perplexed Roman commander far behind. He was now marching into uncharted territory, heading for the Alpine passes as winter began to set in. What followed was a descent into a frozen hell. The Alpine crossing became a desperate struggle for survival against nature itself. The narrow, treacherous paths were often covered in snow and ice. Men and heavily laden baggage animals slipped and plunged thousands of feet into the abysses below. The cold was a relentless enemy, claiming lives every night. To compound the misery, hostile mountain tribes launched constant guerrilla attacks, rolling massive boulders down onto the long, vulnerable columns of soldiers and animals struggling up the slopes. The war elephants, brought to terrify the Romans, suffered immensely. Unsuited for the freezing climate and treacherous terrain, many succumbed to exhaustion or fell from the cliffs. Hannibal was everywhere, leading from the front, sharing the dangers with his men, scouting paths, and offering words of encouragement that kept the army's morale from completely shattering. According to the historian Livy, at one point the army's path was blocked by a massive rock slide. Hannibal ordered a great fire to be built to heat the rock, and then doused it with soured wine or vinegar, a feat of engineering that supposedly cracked the stone, allowing his men to clear a path. After 15 days of unimaginable hardship, a skeletal version of Hannibal's grand army finally emerged from the mountains and looked down upon the green, welcoming plains of Italy's Po Valley. He had started the march with over 50,000 men. He now had barely 26,000, more than half his army, and almost all of his elephants lay dead in the mountains. But he had made it. He was in Italy, and the Roman Republic was completely unprepared. The Romans, stunned that an enemy army had appeared from the one direction they believed to be impassable, hastily scrambled their legions. In the first major clashes at the Ticinus River, and then the Trebia, Hannibal gave them their first taste of his tactical genius. He used his superior Numidian cavalry to outmaneuver the more rigid Roman formations, and chose his ground perfectly. At the Trebia, he lured the Romans, under the command of the rash consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, across the freezing river on a bitterly cold December morning. The Carthaginian troops were well fed and warmed by fires. The Romans were numb, with cold, wet, and hungry. Hannibal's forces, including a hidden contingent led by his brother Mago that attacked the Roman rear, crushed the legions. 2 Roman consular armies had been defeated, and northern Italy was now Hannibal's. The following spring, in 217 BC, Hannibal marched south, and Rome sent a new consul, Gaius Flaminius, to stop him. Hannibal, a master of psychological warfare, bypassed Flaminius's army and began to openly ravage the rich countryside of Etruria, knowing the hot-headed Roman would not be able to resist giving chase. He then laid the most perfect ambush in military history. He concealed his entire army in the forested hills overlooking the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. On a foggy morning, Flaminius marched his army along the narrow path between the hills and the lake, completely blind to the danger. Once the entire Roman column was inside the trap, Hannibal gave the signal. His forces descended from the hills, blocking the entrance and exit, and attacking the surprised Romans from the front, rear, and flank. The Roman army was driven into the lake and utterly annihilated. 15,000 Romans, including the consul Flaminius, were killed. Rome was gripped by terror. In the face of this unprecedented crisis, Rome appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. He initiated a new, cautious strategy. He would shadow Hannibal's army, harass his supply lines, but refuse to engage him in a pitched battle. This Fabian strategy was militarily sound but politically unpopular. The Romans were a proud people, and they craved a decisive victory to avenge their honor. In 216 BC, their patience ran out. Rome amassed the largest army it had ever put into the field, an estimated 86,000 men under the command of two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and the aggressive Gaius Terentius Varro. They cornered Hannibal on the open plains near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. Varro, in command on the day of the battle, was determined to use his overwhelming numerical advantage in infantry to simply smash the Carthaginian line through brute force. Hannibal, facing this massive force with only 50,000 men, devised a plan of breathtaking ingenuity and risk. He arranged his infantry in a shallow crescent, with his weaker Spanish and Gallic troops bulging forward in the center. On the flanks, he placed his elite, battle-hardened African infantry. As the massive Roman center charged, Hannibal's Gauls and Spaniards slowly gave way, as planned. The Roman legions, sensing victory, pushed deeper and deeper into the sagging Carthaginian line, which curved inwards, drawing the Romans into a sack. At the decisive moment, Hannibal gave the signal. His elite African infantry, held in reserve on the wings, wheeled inwards, attacking the exposed flanks of the Roman legions. Simultaneously, Hannibal's superior cavalry, having driven the Roman horsemen from the field, circled around and slammed into the Roman rear. The trap was sprung. The largest army Rome had ever assembled was completely surrounded. What followed was a methodical, pitiless slaughter. Packed so tightly they could barely swing their swords, the Roman soldiers were cut down for hours. By sunset, as many as 70,000 Romans, including the consul Paulus and 80 senators, lay dead on the field. It was a perfect tactical victory, a double envelopment that is still studied in military academies to this day. It remains one of the single most bloody days in the history of warfare. After the cataclysm of Cannae, Rome was on its knees, but it was not broken. In one of history's most debated decisions, Hannibal did not march on the city itself, perhaps lacking the siege equipment and manpower to take the formidable Roman walls. He had expected the victory to shatter the Roman Confederation, but while some southern Italian cities defected, the core of Rome's allies remained loyal. The war devolved into a long, grueling stalemate. For over a decade, Hannibal campaigned up and down the Italian peninsula, a brilliant general trapped in a foreign land, unable to receive adequate support from Carthage, and slowly worn down by the inexhaustible manpower of Rome. The Romans, having learned their lesson, reverted to the Fabian strategy, refusing to face him in open battle. The tide turned when a brilliant young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, adopted Hannibal's own tactics and conquered Carthage's territories. In Spain, then, in a move of strategic genius, Scipio did what Hannibal had done years before. He took the war to the enemy's homeland. Invading North Africa, Carthage, in a panic, recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the city. In 202 BC, on the plains of Zama, the two great generals finally met. This time, it was Scipio who had the superior cavalry. Hannibal's war elephants were neutralized by Scipio's clever tactics, and his army, a mix of veterans and raw recruits, was finally defeated. Hannibal survived the battle and for a time served Carthage as a statesman. But Rome never forgave him, and he was eventually forced into exile. For years he wandered the courts of Eastern kings, a legendary fugitive still trying to ignite a war against his hated enemy. Finally, in 183 BC, cornered by Roman agents in Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, the old general, now nearly 70, stayed true to the oath he had sworn as a boy. Rather than be captured, he took his own life by drinking poison he reportedly carried in a ring. Hannibal Barca lost the war, and his beloved Carthage was eventually destroyed by Rome. Yet, he achieved a different kind of immortality. He was Rome's greatest fear, the ultimate adversary who haunted their nightmares for generations. His audacity, his strategic brilliance, and his epic march across the Alps cemented his legacy as not only Carthage's greatest son, but one of the most formidable and fascinating military commanders the world has ever known. He had fulfilled his oath. He was never a friend of Rome,